our speakers today. I think that each research have like around 19 minutes of presentation. We have like 1 minute for transition, and it leaves us with like 15 good minutes for discussion. Also, we have another like panel after this panel is about water governance in MENA region, and I think that I'm kind of excited to. It's a good opportunity to have like a good discussions about this critical issue in MENA region. So I go to our first speaker, Jihane Benamar, who is a student, graduate student majoring in international politics at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar. Jihane does research in development studies, environmental politics, and political economy. Also, the other speaker of this session is Professor Harry Verhoeven, who teaches at the School of Foreign Service also in Qatar. Georgetown University is also an associate member of the Department of Politics and International Relations of the University of Oxford. His research focuses on elite politics, ideology, and international relations. I apologize if I skip any affiliations or so. Go ahead.
I knew you were going to take it.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be presenting on water security, governance, and the social contract in the Gulf. So water use has been growing at globally twice the rate of population growth in the last century. And this is leading to regions like the Middle East to reach a limit at which the state can no longer sustainably provide water and use it for further development. And this is alarming because water is a basic human right and is essential to the growth and development of any society. More specifically, for the purposes of this presentation and my research, the cases of the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Kuwait help illustrate the magnitude of just how alarming the situation is. For example, for countries that receive between 3 to 7 inches of water a year, these countries display some of the highest water consumption patterns in the world. So, just some graphs to illustrate what I'm talking about. The countries we're looking at are here signposted by the red arrows. And as you can see, they experience absolute water scarcity, where really the lack of water starts to hamper economic development, human health, and well-being generally as compared to other countries that we have here in Europe or other places in the world. Here you have an illustration of internal renewable water resources, which they have, and then the minimum internal renewable water resources that would be needed to sustain these growing countries. And as you see, there's an exponential growth of the need or how much water they would require, but the amount they have is either constant or actually decreasing over time. And so these observations have prompted questions which I look at, such as what do countries like Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE really understand by water security? How does the Gulf see water not just as a biophysical input, but as a social and political variable? And how do water resource management strategies to sustain their economic and demographic growth relate to changes in the wider political economy and concepts of citizenship and the social contract? So just a little bit of theory and to give you some of the important definitions that I use. I take Karen Becker's definition of water security, which is an acceptable level of water-related risks to humans and ecosystems, coupled with the availability of water of sufficient quantity and quality to support livelihoods, national security, human health, and ecosystem services. And this concept has been the object of increasing academic and policy interest. But so has water governance, and again, looking at and the focus on the social, the economic, and the institutional processes that actually articulate the interests of communities vis-a-vis their decision makers. However, what I found lacking in the literature is the role of the governance dimensions of water security and how they define state-society relations. Now, given the political nature of the subject in question, questions of social power are central to our debate on governance and water security. And this is because insecurities do not only arise from environmental pressures and the suboptimal governmental and managerial decisions, but also from power relations and the competition between political and socioeconomic interests with respect to water pricing, distribution, and proprietorships. So as we'll see, when dealing with tribal societies like the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait, this can actually become crucial in understanding what water security means and how this understanding influences state-society relations. Now, a way of overcoming water scarcity that is crucial to these states, except of course from desalination, which everyone talks about, but which I will not be talking about specifically in my presentation, is virtual water trade. This is a term coined by Professor Tony Allen to refer to the hidden flow of water in food trade. And this strategy is actually a favorite amongst the states we're discussing because it allows local politicians to manipulate and withhold information from the public. Unfortunately, however, this deceptive rhetoric leaves a prevailing, unchallenged idea in the region that there is sufficient water to meet the different sectorial needs, and the evidence usually given for this is the absence of municipal water shortages. But this unchallenged veil of ignorance that we have is maintained for reasons that have to do with the political stability of these states. In fact, water policies were and continue to be made behind these veils of ignorance on the basis of unsustainable economic and environmental assumptions. Now, in this graph, I have the food self-sufficiency trend of GCC states over time, and as you can see, they've become less and less self-sufficient. But it's because the population is growing, and a lot of these foods require a lot of water. And you can see here approximately how much water would be required for each. And so by importing a lot of this food, there's this kind of rhetoric that, well, we have enough virtual water to sustain our economic development and our growth generally. So there's no, the population is not generally alarmed by the fact that there is water scarcity. There isn't this thinking that, well, what do we do about water scarcity itself, except by tackling it through these ways. Another example I have here is from Kahrama, which is Qatar's General Electricity and Water Cooperation, and it deals with distributing water throughout Qatar, is this lack of thinking about water security. As you can see in its core objectives, there's a very technocratic rhetoric that comes across, but there's really no mention of just how dire the situation is and how water scarcity is the actual problem. Under this very Kahrama, there's a program of the National Program for Conservation and Energy Efficiency, and the motto of this program is keep Qatar pulsing and consume wisely. So there's always this understanding that as long as we can develop, as long as we can keep growing, consume wisely, again here, wisely, loosely defined, we're doing well. Now, the question that arises, however, is how can a population or the populations in these states that are left unaware of realities such as water scarcity and that exist in a milieu that is not really conducive to associational life flourish and lead their struggle against water scarcity? And the answer lies within established institutions where these, according to Douglas North, are the rules of the game in a society, or more formally, the humanly devised constraints that shape human interactions. And this definition is actually important because it identifies three crucial features of institutions. The first one is that they're humanly devised, which means that they're within the control of humans. Secondly, that they're the rules of the game, which means they set limits on human behavior. And thirdly, that the major effect, or their major effect, will be through incentives. And as will be seen throughout my article, and then I hopefully here, is that incentives through water pricing play a major role in the governance of water security in the Gulf. So valuing and pricing water. Valuing and pricing water is actually, as you may know, a politically sensitive issue in the Gulf because water flow interdependencies are and continue to be connected to tribes and kinships and have generated distinctive patterns of conflict and cooperations in the three states we talk about. So looking at the political nature of water preservation in rentier states, we see that the rentier political nature of GCC states led to a GCC exception, where we have universal access to fresh water for free or for subsidized prices. And this remarkable achievement can be understood in the broader history of ancient rentier welfare state design, which was used by these states to kind of legitimize their rule over tribal societies and any emerging states we have today. So I think overall this fits into the argument that there really is a close link between tribalism, social identity, and water. Now a little bit more on the findings. And if we zoom in into our 3 case studies here, we notice, first of all, that we're talking about 3 rentier states, which means that the state itself plays a central role in distributing wealth to its citizens. But this feature is magnified by the fact that these are actually tribal societies, and therefore the state buys its loyalties from the people. Essentially, then, we have a welfare state in the Gulf. In this sense, putting these 2 characteristics together, we see that we have populations which have for the longest time acquiesced their right to representation for state-provided benefits. And this feature directly affects the way commodities such as water are valued and used. Now, keeping in mind that these countries exist in the driest region in the world, the MENA region, where there are less than 2% of the world's renewable water supply, some of the statistics I'll now share are quite mind-boggling. Qatar, for instance, has only a 48-hour emergency water supply, yet it's one of the world's highest or biggest consumers of an average daily consumption of 500 liters per capita of water. Similarly for the UAE at 550 liters, and for Kuwait at 500 liters. Now, this is more than double the average consumption, the world consumption of 250, 230, and a lot more than other countries that actually are abundant in water and use between 70 to 100 liters per capita daily. Now, the problem is that this water is either free or very cheaply priced. And so by providing fresh water for free or at very low and subsidized prices, these states have instilled a popular perception that this scarce resource is limitless. And this in turn has contributed to a lack of awareness about the water predicament in the region. But implementing financial disincentives in the form of water quotas or taxes may have serious implications for the socio-political stability of these Gulf states. Thus, water matters in ways that have to do with the social contract. In fact, the social contract theory can actually be used to understand the bargain that was established and is still established between the tribal leaders or the sheikhs and their citizens or the merchant classes that have supported these tribal leaders in maintaining power to this very day. Now, there are a number of similarities between our 3 cases. First of all these cases have had their hands forced by the oil crisis in 2014 and have focused somewhat on subsidy reduction. For instance, Qatar in 2015 doubled its electricity and water prices overnight. However, and this is something we'll see throughout the 3 cases, nationals are always exempt from these price hikes. Additionally, a survey conducted by Qatar University's Social and Economic Survey Research Institute, SESRI, asked some 1,500 Qataris in 2015 to what extent they thought nationals should pay for water from a scale of 1 to 10. And 2/3 of the respondents said 0. In another report in 2016 by SESRI again, asked some 1,600 Qataris about the future implementation of VAT tax in the Gulf, and nationals expressed more concern about subsidy cuts than price increases. And they ranked their state benefits priorities by putting free education, healthcare, water and electricity, and public sector employment as priorities they would urge and expect the state or the government to keep free. In the case of Kuwait, in 2014, the country experienced strong resistance amongst its nationals into changing the subsidy arrangement, especially when it came to water, electricity, and basic foodstuff amid the oil crisis. And this is because Kuwait is a little bit different. It's a constitutional monarchy with a parliament, and the parliament somewhat represents the will of the people. And so it's been harder and harder there to push for lower subsidies, to push for nationals to pay higher prices for things such as water and electricity. And even if these taxes are implemented, they usually involve non-nationals, which saw, for example, in 2015, a 500% price hike in their utility bills. So this peculiarity of Kuwait can actually be an added difficulty for its future if it wants to revisit its social contract, because having people that feel kind of entitled, that think they have a say in the decisions taken, it might be harder to kind of convince them or force them into accepting price changes. Now, in the UAE's case, there's been a lot done on the technology front, with research institutes such as Masdar developing innovative ways of reducing water consumption, stimulating grain, and even converting glaciers from Antarctica to bottled water in the UAE. But in terms of utility costs, again, the UAE differentiates between its nationals and non-nationals, like in 2016, where there was a price increase of 23% for the nationals and 32% for the non-nationals. Now, keep in mind that the non-nationals already pay higher prices, and that the Emiratis only started really paying for water in 2015 in Abu Dhabi, and then 2012 in Dubai. However, we could see things changing because there are serious plans of implementing a VAT tax, as we've seen in the UAE, which it implemented on the 1st of January of this year. And so what will be interesting to see in the future is if Gulf citizens will awaken and kind of reclaim their right to participation, or if they will nod along and still find ways to keep the social contract to their advantage nonetheless. However, a problem that I think remains is that these societies have for the longest time fostered a rentier mentality, which makes the rentier social contract the cornerstone of governmental legitimacy. Now, again, these are just some quotes from the Vice President for the Research at the Masdar Institute of Science and Technology, which again show us that there's a lack of thinking about water scarcity as such, and a very technocratic rhetoric saying, well, if we, first of all, we see that they understand that it's hard for people to think that they have to pay for things such as water. In this region, it's not commonly understood. Like it's weird still to pay for water. It should be free or it should be heavily subsidized. And secondly, if we have the right technology, if we're able to desalinate more and more, we'd be able to tackle the problem without any issues. So just to come to my concluding remarks, in the case of the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Kuwait, water security is certainly not a function of biophysical input. Rather, it is intimately linked to a much more deeply ingrained notion of state-society relations, where the backbone of the social contract between the states and its citizens rests on the provision of primary commodities such as water for free. Furthermore, what we've also seen is that there's a common lack of thinking about water security, and this is nefarious as it results in these countries missing out on massive economic opportunities precisely because they're trying to maintain a dysfunctional system of governance based on this veiled ignorance. Thank you.
We can save questions for at the end of session. So let's turn over to our second speaker. Mikaela Bennett is a graduate student in Middle East Studies in Georgetown University. Her research is focused in environment and climate, and also Joshua Kaye, who is also a graduate student in international relations and affairs in George Washington University. He is currently also an intern at U.S. Department of State. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So our presentation, Desalination and Climate, how the restructuring of water is shaping Oman. If you'll, we beg your forgiveness, there's a little rough around the corners. We just got back. We just got back from Oman on Sunday night. So we're still formulating our ideas here, but this is where we are at now, and we hope you find it interesting. The question we're looking at is how the physical restructuring of water, due to the widespread implementation of new technologies such as desalination and a changing climate, altering social and economic arrangements in Oman. And again, we'll give you a little theory.
Yeah, so we're using
So in terms of a little bit of our methodology, our main initial lens is looking at the field of political ecology, which is a relatively new academic discipline and field, and was first used in 1972 in Eric Wolf's article entitled Ownership in Political Ecology, where he stressed the need for studying ecological contexts with social and political history and intergroup relations. And classical definitions resulting from that include varying emphasis on political economy, formal political institutions, and environmental change. So it's kind of a hybrid of multiple disciplines, kind of forming this loose amalgamated discipline. In recent years, there's been some pushback on this, looking to focus more on specific examples and trying to avoid sort of generalizing trends. But we kind of push back on that pushback and kind of look more towards the classical definition of political ecology and looking at two central themes of non-human climate and also human technology as products of human action, and also through the lenses of the political institutions and environmental change. And so we also looked at adaptation, which is incredibly important in the current Omani ecology and also political climate, kind of the ability to adapt to the climatic stimuli, and especially with the increasing effects of climate change. And also the adaptation takes the long view, which we also feel is important to our research. For example, I'm not just looking at a single dry spell, a single drought, but kind of overall in the expectation of persistent rainfall, which was really critical to our research and kind of looking forward to kind of the future of water in Oman. And an adaptation is going to be a primary response to the impacts of climate change.
So adaptation being sort of the human response to environmental factors. We tried to formulate a way to look at the way that non-human factors are affecting humans in the reverse direction, and ran into some dissatisfaction with the terminology that's generally used. So if you'll indulge me really quickly, I'm just going to cover some terms that we're going to try to avoid and clarify why we're doing that and how we're framing this. Modernity and modernization is a common term that you will hear when people talk about Oman, and it's from the 1970s onwards, has kind of, the Sultanate has engaged in a delicate balancing act between, on the one hand, rapid development and modernization, and on the other, sort of curated narratives of traditional society. Modernization is a term that has been so problematized and debated that it's now difficult to know what is meant by the word when you use it. In addition to that, the modernist emphasis on technology and transformation reinforced and manufactured global power structures based on the production of global winners and losers, which we don't wish to participate in. As attempts to decolonize modernization have largely failed, we're going to set that to the side. The next most common term for this, to kind of express what we're getting at here, is development. However, unfortunately, development also has sort of a spotted history for many of the same reasons. It was first created as something that was done by first world countries to third world countries. And in spite of the good intentions of many NGOs and international aid organizations, they continue to stumble on the hubris that is Western problem solving in non-Western contexts. So the third problematic term here is traditional, which is often sort of the posed in opposition to development. You have developed societies and you have traditional societies, and these are not synonymous. So we are going, in our study, we choose to identify behaviors rather than traditions. Our focus here is to look at socio-technical change, to look specifically at technology and climate and how that is affecting society and the economy.
So Our methodology, we, again, as said before, we just got back from about 10 days in Oman doing primary research. So a lot of it was interviews. We met with the Ministry of Water Resources in Oman. We also met with a couple of utility companies, the Public Affairs and Energy Works, and also the Oman Power and Water Procurement, which kind of works a little bit in terms of the privatization of water in Oman. And through this work, we designed an organizational flowchart of how water is managed in Oman, as one doesn't seem to exist. So we hope that this is also a little bit of our contribution to the existing body of literature of water in Oman and the structure of water in Oman. We also went to case sites as well too. We looked around in urban Oman. We went to Muscat proper. We went to Sib, Abila, Rubra, Al Khud, and Mata, and we also went up to the mountains to Jebel Akhtar on the Saik Plain, which is about 2,500 meters above sea level, to get a first-hand look at the afflage and see how climate change and the rainfall is really directly impacting this mountain region and the source of a lot of Omani agriculture.
So just a really fast background for anybody who's not super familiar with Oman. Compared to the other GCC countries we just heard about, Oman has more land and more aquifers, more renewable water sources, which is a positive. On the other hand, it has a larger population, currently just below 4.5 million. So although they are more water rich, per capita it is a challenging situation. Also in terms of usage, compared to the Qatar and the UAE, around like 500 liters a day, Oman comes in at about more like 200 and 250 liters a day. So they are doing better at conserving water as well. The country as we know it is ruled by Sultan Qaboos. He took power in 1970, and usually people use the term the Renaissance to describe what happened after Sultan Qaboos took power and sort of the rapid technological, infrastructural, and bureaucratic change that occurred after 1970, which really transformed the country. And I think, I don't know if you can tell from the picture, but this is roughly the same spot. And this is a picture I took, and this is from about 1970. So that gives you kind of an idea of how much change has taken place. And so going back to our question, what we're really trying to get at today is to put to bed the myth that adaptation means life will go on just as it has before. Frequently successful adaptation is usually, an adaptation works for most, but not all. And in Oman, each phase of adaptation that we see has brought change, and we expect that the next one will as well. And so just looking at what the situation was prior to 1970, the main adaptations to water scarcity in Oman relied on socioeconomic arrangements that were based on geographic location and season, and involved complicated networks of people engaged in different sectors of agriculture and husbandry, for example, such as dates, honey, frankincense, cows, goats, fishing, urban commerce, maritime trade. And these different sectors of society work together to support each other. So, so that each, for example, one sector of society might have one piece of the pie, and then the other one might have the other, and they can trade and facilitate life in a very challenging environment.
Yeah, so as mentioned before, the current Sultan and ruler of Oman, Sultan Qaboos, took power in 1970 and led this massive infrastructure upgrade in Oman. There's a statistic they like to say in Oman that before Sultan took power, they had 6 kilometers of paved roads, and now can kind of look how far they come, just as kind of an example. This is in part fueled by the oil wealth, dating back to the 1970s oil boom in the Persian Gulf as a whole. This allows for the population expands too. This also allows for economic expansion, increase revenues as part of the rentier state. You also have a bureaucratic expansionism as well too. And as you can see, the population has increased almost eightfold since 1970 in Oman, with the current population today of around 4.5 million people. And Oman, as a result of this, also starts to they recognize their water deficits really early on and start becoming a leader in the 1970s, and we'll touch more on this later, starting desalination in 1976 and increasing that more. And so kind of the first wave is really relying on groundwater, a little bit of recharge dam, and also wells. So with this rapid growing infrastructure as well too, you can also increase agriculture and consequently use more water. There's a building out of the piping network. So this is used primarily in the 1970s and 80s. Again, desalination starts in 1976, but really large scale doesn't kick in until the late 80s and early 1990s. The problem with this is that by the 1980s, especially in kind of the coastal Al-Batiniya region, you start seeing a massive depletion of the aquifer, as well as increasing brackish water and salinity, which really harms farmers' ability to water their crops and to do large-scale agriculture in these areas. And Oman's bureaucracy realized that this was not sustainable and that changes were going to be needed. Yes. And then, so this is kind of the end of the first wave, and then kind of a massive turning point is the 1992 water law in Oman, which basically gives the Sultanate of Oman, gives the government control of all water supplies in Oman and the authority to best manage water how they see fit. We kind of see this as a massive turning point in restructuring in how water is managed in Oman, and multiple officials who we talked to cited this as kind of a turning point for them. And then this really also kind of begins the next major phase of desalination as kind of the miracle cure and the solving of Oman's water issues. And so kind of in the second wave, you get large-scale building of desalination plants across the country. This is one small example at the Middle East Desalination Research Center located right on the water in Muscat. And kind of just a little bit of a symbol of Oman's water miracle, as it were. And really this has provided a certain amount of water security for Oman and a certain amount of peace of mind, as the vast majority of Oman's drinking water is now provided by desalinated water, and this includes both urban and rural areas.
And just add a little footnote to that. It's key to remember that desalination tends to be useful water for drinking water, but not irrigation, and it also tends to be used in farms on the coastline to prevent saltwater intrusion, but it is expensive and it is subsidized. So it's not a perfect solution. So there's been a shift to conservation, kind of in tandem with the turn to desalination after the utilization of the groundwater in the 80s. However, in a lot of the interviews that we conducted, entitlement was a common theme in the interviews. The water in Oman is heavily subsidized, as we heard, and it was acknowledged and supported by a lot of the representatives that the idea that water is a human right and it should be provided by the government. Most middle-class Omanis pay around 1% or less of their monthly income on water, which is really low for any country, particularly an arid country. also, there was an interesting comment that was made that, which is why we have this picture here of bottled water, is that in spite of the advent of desalinated water in Oman for drinking water, the Omani population seems to prefer drinking bottled water over desalinated water. So, you know, the consumer preferences are definitely changing the supply of water.
And so there are limits to government intervention. There's heavy subsidies on water. The water costs about 3 or 4 times more to produce each liter of desalinated water than the consumers actually charged. Additionally, infrastructure to rural areas. They actually are in the process of building a pipeline to our case study, Jebel Akhtar, which we'll get to in a little bit, which means requiring pumping water 2,500 meters up a mountain, which is obviously very costly and energy inefficient. And there's also inefficient project in rural areas. The government has made a policy and a concerted effort to build desal plants in rural areas, and to try to avoid population movement as well, to keep people in traditional industries. Again, water is a human right and part of the social contract, and preventing people from moving into the urban areas, and again having to provide services there, and potentially causing political unrest. And yes. And there's also reduced economic capacity in Oman. Oman is facing a massive budget shortfall as well too. There have been some projections that they're supposed to run out of money in about 2 years. And as multiple officials told us, while they couldn't directly tell us about these things, this is not something that's politically acceptable in Oman at the moment, they did tell us that the 5-year plan for water was not adopted. They showed us the books, but they said it wasn't adopted because it was too costly and just was not going to fit into the budget. And the population in the industry is increasing pressure on the water supply. Like many other countries in the MENA region, Oman has a massive youth bulge as well, which is only pushing the increase in the population. There's also, again, the increase in industry. And also agriculture, despite being an inefficient industry in Oman, only accounting for about 1.5% of GDP, uses between 80-90% of the country's water supply. The country's also facing reducing oil supply as well as a price reduction, and also GDP growth rates down. And there's also high unemployment as well too, and even some of the employment is also, the jobs are not particularly high paying.
Now we go to our case study, Jebel Akhtar. This is what Josh was just talking about with, excellent, we're going to speed through this. With the reduced economic capacity of government to provide water is particularly relevant for Jebel Akhtar. We use it as a case study. In spite of government efforts, the groundwater is disappearing. They rely primarily on reflage water systems, which comes from groundwater and from springs, natural springs. They're sort of community-owned and maintained water systems, and they provide free drinking water, and they divide irrigation water based on time allotments as opposed to cost of money. In a 1990s survey, they cataloged, by UNESCO survey, they cataloged about 4,000 flage. Only about 3,000 are in operation today. And this is really the picture that sparked everything for us, is that these are agricultural terraces. This is the Jebel Akhtar region. There's 3 towns kind of over here. And as you can see, about 3/4 of the terraces are completely dry. And this is really kind of like the big tourist view when you go to Jebel Akhtar. The main issues that we've been able to uncover is that because of the water scarcity, agriculture is becoming unprofitable. Other food sources are cheaper. The region is experiencing urban migration, such that people who have rights to these plots of lands are sometimes even hiring foreign labor to do the work and managing these plots of land at a loss. Just for a quick comparison, this is what the tourist brochures show when you look at the region. We're going to jump through. This is sort of the current practices. These are adaptations that they're doing to kind of shore up the afflage system by bringing in water by tankers and providing it by pipeline instead of running it through the actual afflage channels. The sign here, if you can read it, says afflage water unsuitable for human use, which is ironic because it's supposed to be drinking water for the community. Some of the solutions that are being proposed would inherently restructure the afflage system by replacing the technology. This picture really showcases the limits of the success possible in this region because even though Jabal Akhtar is sort of a success story in that the government is investing in a highly inefficient pipeline to bring desalinated water all the way from the coastline 3,000 meters up to the mountains, that desalinated water is too costly to support the agriculture. However, it's just fine for the five-star resorts. So these were the general changes we observed while we were there. And we had a few brief insights, questions for the future, which we can come back to maybe in Q&A. And definitely a lot of people that we could have talked to in Oman that we would love to talk to in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay. Our last speaker today is Dr. Nejm Benessaiah, who is assistant professor at Georgetown University and anthropologist with a regional specialization in North Africa, focusing on political ecology, sustainable agriculture, and climate change.
Thank you. Do I need to use this?
Yes.
I do? We're recording. Okay, great. So I don't have any slides, so you'll just have to bear with me. My current research is actually on water, and I teach on water at the moment, but today I'm going to be talking actually about farmer associations in Algeria, in the Sahara. So today I'll be arguing that Algerian society may be undergoing a subtle transformation towards democracy despite an authoritarian state and a lack of Arab-style uprising. So using a case study from a very traditional Berber community of Abadi Muslims, I'll be discussing today how voluntary associations are replacing customary patriarchal social relations in the governance of daily life. So in 1965, Kenneth Little had identified ways that voluntary associations in West Africa served as adaptive mechanisms for members of communities experiencing rapid change, with tribal institutions becoming replaced or supplemented by new organizational forms. Civil society then can be thought of as the total of self-initiating, self-regulating, volitional social formations peacefully pursuing a common interest, advocating a common cause, or expressing a common passion. Okay? So, as we all know, a brief recap of history in Algeria, very brief. In the 1990s, civil society was the great hope for democracy in Algeria and to some extent the rest of the Middle East, following de Tocqueville's formulation of such groups as schools for civic virtue. This perception carried on even during the terrible violence of that decade. Without any significant political transformations by the turn of the century, not to mention the takeover of the first truly democratic elections by the military in 1992, the democratic role of associations has become increasingly contested by scholars. Some have even argued that associations supported authoritarian regimes. For others, associations were categorized as too weak or divided to make any meaningful change. For others, so part of the argument is that effective political transformation is stifled by the corrupt patronage networks that hold up authoritarian regimes. Okay, so during the Arab uprising of 2011, the Algerian associations were criticized for their lack of coherency and weak response. On the other hand, they were criticized by the regime as not having prevented enough trouble. So for Algerian citizens, on the other hand, they were very resistant to seeing yet more violence and instability, even though many were disgusted by state corruption, described as hogra, and lack of basic services, despite considerable oil wealth. Not quite at the level of the GCC countries, but still considerable, and it's not trickling down to everyday citizens. So recently, some scholars have argued that in the absence of political parties and true opposition, associations do create a space in which politics is enacted. Butcher, for example, in 2014, has challenged criticisms of Algerian associations during the Arab Spring. And for a number of associations with different backgrounds, both Islamist and secular, did actually combine to form the National Coordination for Change and Democracy, the CNDC. This included the Algerian League of Human Rights, cultural organizations, student bodies, trade unions, and activists and intellectuals. This platform called for political reform, and in response, the government ended the state of emergency that had been in place since 1992. So they achieved some significant results. So Algeria has a long history of religious and local community-based collective decision-making and associational activism. The FLN, for example, in its rise to power after the 1962 War of Independence, was heavily reliant on associative connections in its early formation. However, the party, under the narrative of unification, refused to accept political plurality and conflict, and thus the freedom of association was extremely limited. It was essentially cut off. The associative sphere was reopened in 1988 following popular protests and riots, with the condition that associations are banned from engaging in politics and challenging the state. Okay? So since then, over 93,000 voluntary associations have mushroomed in Algeria, compared to about 50 or 60,000 in Morocco today. These cover activities such as sports, disability, unemployment, neighborhood groups, and farmers' collectives, as I'm going to be talking about, essentially covering a lot of social services. Finally, Northeast 27 article argues that associations formed to protect cultural heritage, including vestiges of Andalusian heritage, challenging the state's narrative of what should be remembered in terms of the unitary identity formed during its national building project, the project of state building. So Northey argues that associations she studied through democratic systems of governance are inclusive and tolerant. They have these structures. She further argues that associations do not necessarily need to oppose the government to contribute to political reform. So, while some civil society leaders go on to run for office in town councils, associations create a space for public engagement through the enactment of voluntary relations and with different opinions. Conflict is allowed. There's shared spaces of some kind of political activity, and they may have these shared goals despite conflicts. They're kind of a practice ground for differences of opinion. So my own work in Algeria relates to such quotidian, informal politics in the associative sphere among farmers, agronomists, and environmentalists for conserving the environmental and cultural heritage of desert oases in Ghardeia by the Mozambique Berber community. So rather than mass movements, I theorize the action of associations as enacting a gradual political change through changing cultural beliefs, thoughts, and practices. I term these group micro-social movements as they take place at the micro-political level within societies. I argue that by reformulating relations along voluntary inclusive lines, these organizations reformulate power relations away from traditional patriarchy, for example, to some extent. I further suggest that despite being banned from challenging the state, a number of the collective nature of these groups enables them to push for political action in basic service provision and policy reform. So I'm going to talk now about the Tazdate Agricultural Association in Ghardeia. So date palms are keystone species to many in North Africa, such as the Mazab, where I undertook 12 months of field work over 2012 and 2013. Furthermore, local knowledge and expertise is dwindling regarding the date palm and its cultivation, as new labor is drawn away to the petrochemical sector, which provides more status-enhancing work and real wealth, whether for skilled or unskilled labor. In response, associations such as Tazdate have arisen to preserve this local livelihood and knowledge. It was spawned by a 5-year participatory management program in the Maghreb in 1999 by Biodiversity International, funded by UNEP GEF. Farmers and date palm climbers, known as fourniciculteurs in the French, also who participated in this initiative, decided to continue it by themselves. They took on this language of participation and said, hey, why don't we just do this ourselves and carry on, using under the sphere of the openness of freedom of association. The primary role of Tazdate was to protect and valorize the tree climber livelihoods and knowledge, and to protect date palms against the deadly disease Bayoud, which has devastated most of the date palm industry in Morocco. Tazdate now has about 11 members made up of tree climbers and agronomists and general environmentalists. Arguably, the success of Tazdate is because they've always created locally achievable goals aimed at the local scale. For example, they've published an important book on local tree climber knowledge. I went there to go and to publish a thesis on it, and I realized they'd already done it pretty much. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have to change tack here. Also, through the support of Bennett, a small French NGO, they secured the assistance of Petzl, which is a company that makes mountain climbing harnesses, who agreed to work with Tazdate to design innovative harnesses for these tree climbers. And I was there and I watched them. I didn't try the harnesses on, but there was some interesting work going on there. But because falling constitutes a real livelihood risk. I know someone who lost 2 years of work just from falling out of a date palm, and some of those things are enormous. Future projects involve developing further security for tree climbers, such as insurance, but also research and investments into animal attraction, creating a blacksmith shop, and entering the fair trade movement for local produce, for example. So positions such as the president, the secretary, treasurer, and so on are all chosen through voting. I was present during one of these sessions when the elections were held. The affair was quite informal. A name would be suggested, and the majority of members voted yes. In practice, it was stated that there was a lack of young people, and older people were worried about the renewal of the association. And therefore, young people were kind of encouraged and cajoled into positions such as vice treasurer and so on. So they were aware of the reproduction of this association. So Tazdate interacts with other farming groups across Algeria and the Maghreb under the umbrella organization called Rado, which is basically a network of sustainable development of oasis all across North Africa. This NGO is externally funded and works to provide a network of different farmer groups across the Maghreb, primarily working on oasis issues. Some of the problems they're currently working on include adaptation to climate change, promotion of responsible tourism, integrated management of water resources, and the economic development of oases. So these are very much bigger, top-level kind of projects from the blacksmith shop type of thing that we saw by these smaller groups. So I participated in several of these meetings, and farmers would discuss local problems with the intention of producing practical solutions. I often heard the criticism, however, that for all the managerial talk and the use of graphs and so on, very little else actually materialized. One farmer stated the problems of these larger organizations tackled were far too generalized, and the people discussing them were too remote, whereas the smaller groups such as Tazdate were able to solve small but actually very realizable problems, and therefore generate real results. I also interviewed another association president named Mohamed Brik from nearby La Rouat, who related to me some of the actions that presidents and associations actually could take in terms of political action. They weren't supposed to take political action and challenge the state, but some would just said, well, we have a collective, well, let's just push, and try. Well, what's the worst that's going to happen? So he related to me, for example, when he saw how sewage was running into the river, where people were forced to drive after the bridge was closed. He gathered a petition of 25 landowners and emailed it to the local council. The official was away that day in Algiers, but his secretary called him in. They decided to rush to open the bridge the next day. So there was a small but a political success there. In another case, he related that someone started building a legal enterprise in the area, in an area designated for farming land. He started writing letters, the gendarmes came in, and they moved him out. He stated to me, "We are the watchers, and I'm not afraid to put my name to a document." So this story, I would say, highlights the importance of leadership in organizing and pressuring the state. The state has since attempted to extend its influence into other administrative attempts to extend its influence through other administrative means, such as changing the regulations to make it harder for certain groups that cause trouble, such as making accounting rules more complex or other such means. We know this kind of anthropology of bureaucracy is making it harder, more and more red tape, basically, as some ways of trying to hold back the power of civil society. So in September of 2013, before I left, they changed the rules again, requiring detailed accounts going back the previous 3 years and other regulations. This was around the time of the surrounding Arab uprisings, and so while causing complications in some areas, the state made concessions in others, such as subsidizing interest-free loans for small investors in agricultural land, as well as training. So, to conclude, so the current rise of voluntary associations in Algeria doesn't, I argue, constitute some kind of linear progression from a traditional hierarchical forms of governance to a modern, and I say modern with quotes, democratic ones. Rather, the present composition, I would say, reveals the continued existence of multiple mixed forms of political behaviors, including authoritarian rule in the form of the state, to some degrees the family, the tribe, and so on, and liberal market-driven behavior in the labor market, in the economy, in some ways, and then consensus-based egalitarian decision-making in the form of organizations such as associations. The existence of these mixed modes of governance could be seen as a society in transition, as newer forms gradually replace the old. I would argue, however, that this hybrid composition, in fact, constitutes a negotiated form of modernity, particular to the Algerian situation, rather than showing evidence of a move towards a Euro-style or Euro-American style type of development. So while we often take Western democracy as the end goal, radical revolution may not be the preferred transition process of the Algerian people. That the associations are able to even challenge the hierarchy of local elites, for example, not through violence or even through directly confrontational means, but rather by simply doing things differently, by organizing in inclusive, voluntary ways, and actually achieving results seems pause for hope. Thank you.
Thank you all. Let's open up for some questions. Anybody have a question?
What are some statistics in terms of water? You know, we have like 30 inches of water here in Oman. How many inches of water do they get a year there? What's likely to happen? I mean, long-term aquifers are just
they're not getting enough
resource.
rainfall to recharge. I don't have the exact figure off the top of my head of how much rainfall they're getting right now.
Yeah, it also depends the region of Oman too.
Yeah.
So we're focused in northern Oman, so more the dry arid region. Salalah in the south gets a lot more rainfall due to monsoons from June to September. If I remember correctly, it was somewhere between it was about 100 millimeters a year, sometimes less as well too, of rainfall. So in inches, it's 3 inches of rain or less.
The main issue is that it's coming
A
inconsistently.
tenth of what we get.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, it's definitely a desert by any classification. And most of the rain comes, and also when the rain does come to, a lot of times it's just these 2-hour downpour, and there's no vegetation in the hills to stick as well too, so a lot of the water gets swept out to sea, which is part of the reason for the dams as well too, the
Jebel
recharge and
Akbar
storage.
actually doesn't have any aquifers per se, so they don't have, other parts of Oman have an aquifer that they can pull from. Jebel Akbar's not porous enough, so that's why they're particularly sensitive.
like parallels to California and stuff like that.
Yeah.
With the groundwater recharge, are they primarily the mountainside groundwater recharge dams, or are there other types of managed groundwater recharge in Oman?
So, not for the mountains, because like I said, they don't have aquifers, at this elevation to recharge, and it's pretty far. But near the coastline, they are using desalinated water sometimes to recharge aquifers close to the coastline to push back an intrusion of seawater.
And there's also dams, they've been building dams in the wadis as well to try to trap some of this water coming down from these storms and try to artificially recharge the groundwater in the coastal aquifers as well. But yeah, the mountain geology is not conducive to recharging in aquifers.
So there's no, so another way to do managed recharge is to take somewhat brackish water and have the soil be a natural filter for the salts. Is there any implementation of that type of managed?
They said that the soil layer between the two layers was too thin, the membrane, in order to do that. In some of the interviews we encountered, so it'd be a little more difficult to do it specifically in the coastal aquifer in Oman.
Okay.
I think something that we have to gloss over at the end here is that a lot of the officials we spoke to seem to kind of have this awareness in a very fuzzy way that this is unsustainable, and the flash system being not more than just a technology, but it's a social institution, that being unsustainable would have other ramifications that are not simply in terms of agricultural output.
Is there any agriculture that's how much food or how many percent of their food is produced locally or domestically? Do you have any idea? Is there any huge agriculture sector or not?
So it's about 1.5% of GDP. So, and actually the agriculture sector has been rapidly decreasing since right before the water law in 1991. 10% of the population was working in agriculture. It's now down to 5% today. And especially in a lot of the university professors we talked to, that they really didn't see the viability of an agricultural sector. Additionally, you would talk about exporting water and importing water. So Oman, in a lot of ways, actually is net exporting a lot of water through production of crops like dates, pomegranates, really water-intensive crops. And these staple crops are things that they have to import as well too, the rice, flour, etc. So it's really, and since water takes up 80-90% of Oman's water supply, it's just a really inefficient use of water and heavily damaging to the groundwater, to the aquifers, and sustainability of just kind of the traditional systems of water management in that regard.
Jeff, I think that I think that Oman has a better situation in terms of political stability, and that's actually helped them to import all staple crops without any concern about their security so yeah, that's in compared to other Gulf countries that have a lot of political concern about importing staple crops. Just go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for Jihane. Thank you for your talk, that's very informative. I started doing research on that area myself, and I was wondering, being there, how are people reacting to the lowering of subsidies from both the rural areas and the urban areas, the differences there. And I also noted the kind of entitlement to water as being a difficult issue in terms of personal stability. Do you think that's, the way you phrase it, is that tribal identity, or is it more of a recent cultural entitlement? And then finally, what's the role of environmental education?
Right. So regarding the first question, they try not to cut subsidies for the locals because they have, say, a greater say. So if they want to kind of change the subsidy, they will do that for non-nationals because they can be obliged to pay those prices anyways. And so they will try to keep the subsidies for the locals as they are because then they'll create political instability, and they don't want that to happen. Instead, they will compensate by increasing utility prices for non-nationals much more.
I thought I saw it go up in the UAE recently.
Yeah, so in the UAE it did go up, but it's always less than for non-nationals, and it's also that they've recently started paying for this, but they compensate in other ways. Like in the UAE, they have free education, right? For the most part, they send them abroad for masters or PhDs for free again. So they somehow compensate for their local populations, not to make them feel that there are changes happening. That's one important thing. Regarding your second question about
the rural
right.
populations and their identity to water or
Right.
rights.
So yeah, it's definitely linked to the tribal mentality and the fact that water has always been something that they were provided for free. The life was around water. Right? When there was a well and there was a place of water, that's where the tribes kind of stayed and people lived. And so this has always been the understanding of these people, that we support the chef, we support the leader of our tribe, but he will give us water for free, or he will give us these commodities for free. And so this has grown with them. So even if now we're developed and we know that you have enough oil to pay for this, so we expect somehow that redistribution of wealth through things like commodities for free, through education for free, and all these things. We're not asking you for direct money, but this at least you have to concede to us. And like I said in the report, when they ask the national population, so do you think you should be paying for water? It's absolutely not. Why would we pay for something like this, right? I mean, we provide support, we don't say anything, we acquiesce that right to choose who is going to rule. So at least you give us commodities for free. And the third question was about education.
Yeah, environmental education.
There is some environmental education. I was looking at the Ministry of Education, kind of the curricula in Qatar, in the UAE, and in Kuwait. Definitely there is more awareness, especially in Qatar, because they want a knowledge-based economy. And so they're trying to rate, and you'll see in the streets like signs such as, consume wisely, or water is an important resource, it's a scarce resource. But at the same time, consumption is not going down. If you have something for free, especially in the nationals, if you have something for free, you're not likely to use less of it. And for non-nationals, it's still much cheaper than in Europe or than in other places. So still, if there is awareness in schools, but then if you don't implement it at home, then there's only so much that will affect.
Right. There's the same thing happening in Egypt.
Right.
They're very wary of introducing pricing. Even if they like to, if they've seen it work in Japan or so on, they're refusing to, especially with the climate now, and farmers will say, no way. But the argument would be, well, we're providing the infrastructure, we're not paying for water, we're paying for the services or the concrete or the maintenance, but they're not willing to do it now. But there's a really interesting article by Tessa Farmer on pricing, if you wanted to look into that for your research, which is great. I can email it.
Right.
How does that tribal politics play in?
I think there you're really talking about Sultan Qaboos and in that position of so when you talk about the consolidation of political power, it had connections to water infrastructure, and that was a key service that was provided by the state, and it had a very prominent position in initial statements by the Sultan in the 1970s. This is something to provide. You have the idea that the Aflaj, you should not charge for water, but there was less, there seemed to be less resistance towards pricing, and all of the officials we were speaking to were very pro-privatization and very pro-charging for water, and really calling for increases.
How does that work with education, with scarcity? Because as you told, scarcity is not as much as prices in Oman compared to Qatar, but in Qatar it doesn't work. In Oman, as you said, people are pro-charging, pro-pricing. How does that work? Do you have any idea how does that work? Deterring Oman from Qatar or other countries?
Socially?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have time to really.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to delve into speculation a little bit, I mean, in terms of consolidation of power, the Sultan has really consolidated power in Oman. We could kind of see it even just looking at the cult of personality there, and kind of building off of that as well. In terms of the population itself, I mean, there's definitely they're trying to get the population to conserve, like in the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait. They've been launching all kinds of conservation campaigns, from the mosques to the stores. It's not necessarily working, and the officials to a person really said that they want to get the level down to maybe 100, 150 liters of consumption a day. But they also acknowledge that, especially given within the lifestyle changes in Oman, people having washing machines, etc., it's not necessarily viable at this point in time. So there's going to be kind of an impasse at some point. Politically, water-wise, economically, things are going to come to an head. I mean, really what we found is that this current structure of water is not sustainable.
I have a question for Nish. Can you talk a little bit about the cooperatives that you study? Do they work at all with other associations or together? Are there any kinds of networks that they form to work on a different scale? And also, what is the sort of, are they seen as a threat? Like, is there a lot of surveillance, or are they sort of dismissed? I mean, what sort of politically are they? How are they seen by the state?
Wow. I don't know if I could speak for the state because it's so opaque and figuring out and working with power. In terms of surveillance, I'd love to know the answer to that. I mean, I haven't heard claims of there being direct kind of shutting down. I know they very reluctantly opened the associative sphere in the first place to give any kind of freedom of association, but they've made it harder for associations to just work through all this red tape. They are creating these kind of bigger networks, but the people would say to me they're just really not acting on. They're not very effective. They're working on these kind of bigger ideas of climate change, and there's some kind of transference of knowledge. So there are things happening where they'll visit each other's research sites and say, okay, what are your local problems? What are your local solutions? So there's kind of transfer in terms of local and so-called modern, knowledge practices and that type of thing. But in terms of any other acts, political pressure or larger projects, I don't see anything. I mean, it's not to say that that's minimal, but they're thinking about climate change in a collective fashion, across the whole map. On the other hand, some people say, well, it tends to be a bit elitist because it's only wealthy farmers that can afford to go off to these conferences. Might be on the island of Jerba in a nice hotel. Someone says to me, how on earth am I supposed to leave my field and go and do that? I'd love to know the answer to the first question. How afraid they are of the authorities are of the associations. It depends to be seen, I guess.
Well, I was thinking in Algeria in your study, sometimes might we suffer a little bit from Western idealism about democracy, and that really what people want is they want problem solving, the details you were talking about. The parallel that came to my mind is in China. We kept thinking, the Chinese, were really going to be demanding more democracy. And frankly, the numbers really seem, or the activities seem to be that people like having more things and problems solved. So, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I use democracy warily, generally, and I was also wary in my conclusion not to mix up a kind of a Western style democracy with the type of, so-called modernities, and phrasing it as an Algerian modernity, not one that tends to, has to follow directly in our kind of path. But I do see people wanting to have more inclusion. I mean, I don't want to be overly, optimistic or naive, but I'm having spent a year among people actually doing these things, some kind of inclusion in just running daily life. I mean, people are are doing that anyway. There's been, the presence of elites running things for a while, whether it's at the state level or at, the regional levels. But I've seen people saying, well, you know what, we've got this, maybe this is another model, participation. But let's indigenize it. Let's not do participation in a Western style, let's do it in our style.
But how do you deal with the conflict of the thing at the local level and also then the mega issues of coming along the change, meaning radical shifts in certain things? Is it education? We haven't gotten into that, and that role is in the longer term.
Why haven't I got into that?
In your talk, but your thoughts on that. It seems to me there's an inherent thing in terms of even in economic development. If you have to invest in infrastructure, and that means it's consuming less now. And the more you put authority into the local organization, the more traditional the answers are going to be. They're going to be very practical given their knowledge of that. But it seems like some of these issues you read, water, etc., have a bigger picture in this conflict.
So are you saying in terms of conflict between the local and the state's visions for change, whether it's a very practical approach at the local, but then at the...
Sorry, excuse me. I have to just, because we already passed the